Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today is another episode of Eric Helms' Anecdotes and Observation series, this time featuring Brian Miner as they talk all about rep load zones. When the recording starts, Eric will tell you a bit more about his guest, how they met, and what type of work he's been up to in the past few years, but I also wanted to give you a quick little bio for good measure here before we start the show. Brian Miner is a professional natural bodybuilder, USAPL powerlifter who's competed at the Arnold Sports Festival Invitational meet multiple times, and an accomplished coach that we hold in very high regard here as a team at 3DMJ. In this episode, Eric and Brian discuss the actual mechanisms by which different rep load zones can produce similar hypertrophy and how that ties into progressive overload. They also talk about the practical applications of these mechanisms, how bodybuilders should train, whether they should use multiple rep ranges, and how powerlifters can use this information to both gain maximal strength and size without beating themselves into the ground with lots of volume at heavy loads. To learn more about Brian and to read his insightful blog post related to hypertrophy, strength gain, training, and nutrition, visit myojournal.com. That's myojournal.com. I'm going to go ahead and let the guys get into it. Here's episode 109, all about rep load zones with Brian Miner and Eric Helms.
3DMJers, welcome back to Anecdotes and Observation. That's AO, where I have my friend and colleague Brian Miner, who I believe, the first time I met Brian Miner, the first time I became aware of the man who is Brian Miner must have been in around 2010 or 11. I want to say you were doing your NGA pro debut with Berto, is that right?
Yeah, 2012 actually.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the first time, and I think we had talked about. I think that was right before you went to New Zealand too, so it was cool looking at some of the. We had sort of discussed some of your research before that. So that was it's been fun for sure.
Yeah, man. So I think a lot of people in the 3DMJ audience know you as that dude in Colorado who trains with Berto, which is not untrue sometimes. It's not.
Berto should be the one that trains with me.
Absolutely. That's what I think.
Yeah. Everyone's moving here, and I always like to make it clear that I've been the one here the entire time, and just everyone just gathers around me.
You're allowing them
I've granted access. Yeah.
You're
allowed them in my bubble.
That's right. So to give our folks a little more context to who you are, can you give me a little more background as far as your career as both a coach and athlete, and also your academic background? Just for
I guess I own my own coaching company. Just BD Minor Coaching. Those are my initials. Nothing flashy there, but I am a raw powerlifter in the USAPL. 93 kilo weight class. I've done a meet as an 83. I've competed at the Arnold Pro Raw Challenge 3 times. Was fortunate enough to qualify. I've never been extremely competitive at that meet, but it's something I guess I'm proud of because it's getting harder and harder to get into that meet. So I would say a slightly above average powerlifter. And I'm also a natural pro bodybuilder. I won my pro card in 2012 working with Berto. And then I took 5 years off and competed this year with him at IPF Worlds or IPE Worlds.
Whatever it is now.
Yeah, whatever the acronym for the league is these days. I've competed 3 times this year. And now I'm just taking this year more or less away from competing. I think I may do nationals, but just putting the focus more on, I think, coaching and, just focusing on the content side of things. But as far as education, my bachelor's degree, when I first went to school, I wanted to study health and exercise science, and I actually sort of got convinced out of it just because you can't really do much with a bachelor's in exercise science.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. But I ended up doing construction management, actually, and I went to Colorado State University. It was they're a really big school for that program. So graduated in 2008, right when the economy went to hell, and
right when no one will construct anything.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I went from being a program that had like 100% job placement to like 20%. So that was just unfortunate timing. But what it did do is allow me to kind of rekindle my passion for things. And I went back, took some prerequisites, applied for grad school at CSU for health and exercise. And then I completed that in 2011. And then since then, I've been doing some coaching. I actually worked for 3 years in the construction management industry while just sort of establishing and bringing, I guess, getting my feet underneath me as a coach anyway. And then now I'm doing this full time. So it's been an unusual but fun ride for sure.
Yeah, I don't. And the funny thing is, I don't know that there is a usual for people who end up getting into like bodybuilding and powerlifting coaching. Like I think.
No. Yeah.
All of us had a day job until we got our coaching business to a point where we didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's people that make that leap, but it's just a hard thing to do.
Yeah, they have Wi-Fi in their car for a while and live there. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Well, cool, man. So you've got an academic perspective from doing your master's. You have a lot of personal and client experience, and you've recently started a blog, which we'll definitely link in the comments of this section. And you've asked some really cool questions that I found very stimulating. I think anyone who's been following me on Instagram, or even better, if you're following Brian on Instagram, you notice there was a quote from your first article, and correct me if I have it a little bit wrong, but paraphrasing it, it's that your ability to lift more weight is the outcome of progressive overload versus the cause of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what it said. I don't know if it was worded that way, but yes, that's exactly
close enough, right?
Yeah, that's the point.
Which I think, would have rocked my socks just not that long ago, because it's something that if those who have been following AO, that's like something I discussed in that first video. And I think especially with and let me know your thoughts on this, especially as powerlifting and bodybuilding have gotten a little closer together, at least in kind of the drug-free, evidence-based little odd niche that we've sort of developed, sort of lived in, that might be something that would not be the baseline perspective of most people. So I think that was a really valuable blog. And what inspired you to write that, and where did that perspective come from for you?
Honestly, well, your first AO video, you kind of talked about progressive overload, and it sort of sparked my interest to dive a little bit deeper into it. Like basically the blog process for me, it's like I usually don't know my thoughts on the topic until I start writing it. It just helps me really refine my thought process on it. So, we know that we can grow with pretty much any intensity, and rep range. And I think I just wanted to understand mechanistically, like why, and sort of theorize as to why that is. And we know, like Schoenfeld had that paper in 2010, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy with, metabolic stress, mechanical tension, and muscle damage. And I think since then, there's been some proposed adjustments to that, or, some proposed alternative explanations for some of that. And I know Menno Henselmans is one of those people that is kind of proposing that mechanical tension is the primary driver and metabolic stress is more of a modulator and of that outcome, and that muscle damage is just kind of a byproduct of it all. So I think with it all being corollary to one another, I think it's hard to sort of tease out what is what, and I think we're still in the process of doing that. But for me, I think just writing that paper, one thing that I started to, or article, not paper, but one thing I started to kind of think about is I think a lot of people associate the term mechanical tension with just heavier weight. And they just assume, mechanical tension is a driver. That means like the heavier you lift, the more load on the bar, the more tension. And I think, we know, based on the size principle, we recruit more muscle fibers. And so thinking about, as we fatigue to maintain the force output. And I think as we sort of look at the research, like, okay, well, if we're using such a light load with, a 30 rep set versus an 8 rep set, like the mechanical tension per rep is less, but I think it really boils down to tension per fiber, like the amount of active fibers shouldering that load. Because if we have a light load with, only a handful of high threshold motor units, covering that, the tension per fiber can actually be significantly greater. And I don't know if that's something that's really been looked into or teased out completely. I know Schoenfeld has a paper coming out soon, looking at the research regarding like muscle fiber type differences in hypertrophy across loading spectrum. So I think that'll provide a little bit more insight. But I think for me it's, we know that the closer we are to failure, the more active recruitment we're going to have. But we also know that a lot of people associate EMG with activation. We know that a lot, like heavy loads, will have higher peak and average EMG ratings than like low loads. But one of the knocks on EMG is it doesn't really look at it. It's just like a snapshot into what's active at any given moment. And it doesn't account for potential like motor unit dropout or recycling. And I think that can sort of like, I guess my whole theory or where my mind went with this is sort of contingent on the idea that as you progressively push closer to failure with those higher rep sets, you're still getting a lot of mechanical tension, but it would almost be contingent on the fact that you're getting some like low threshold dropout in order for those higher threshold ones to have to cover the slack on that. And I don't know if that's exactly true. I just think it's interesting. And I think there's, the alternative explanation could just be that there's, varying types of muscle fiber hypertrophy between loading spectrums. So yeah, I guess that was kind of a long-winded answer, but it was more just me just kind of nerding out, trying to answer the question in my own head. I know, you and I talked a little bit throughout that process. And at one point I was sort of thinking like, okay, well, if load progression isn't necessary, then why is performance really important? And I think, ultimately it's just in order for us to be able to recruit that full pool of muscle fibers. And that's also a hypothesis. But I think like for progressive overload, it sort of distills down to like, if we just chase, like say we could fully recover to the point where we're getting, we're recovering our ability to produce force, is progressive overload simply being achieved by just pushing to a high enough relative intensity per set? Like, does it really need to get any more complicated than that? And I think that sort of explains like what I see in the gym, with people that are less, following less evidence-based approaches that still aren't hurting for development, but they're just, pushing really hard. It's like they're checking that box in just a different manner. They're accruing high levels of tension because they're pushing to high relative intensity versus pushing the weight up necessarily. So yeah, there's a lot of downstream implications of that, but it's, and I don't know if I'm completely right. I think it's something that still needs to be answered, but I think that for me, that idea answers a lot of potential questions.
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot to tackle in that. So I think the big one to start with is that I think most people, when they think of a high rep set, their first thought, if they're kind of engaged with the literature, would be, oh, that works due to metabolic stress. Mm-hmm. But it's a really, really interesting point that it might just be working for the exact same mechanism as heavy loads. It's just that accrual of tension occurs over the length of the set versus immediately, and then you get as much you can before you can no longer move that external load.
Right.
And I think that is correct, just based on what we know about force transmission. I know one thing that blew my mind when I was coming up in my master's was there was a picture that they showed us of a muscle that they'd burned out all of the actual fiber tissue, but left all the intra and extracellular matrix. So you can see all the stuff that creates connection. And it's this crazy cool, like 3D spiderweb thing. And then when you start to learn about like costomeres and like lateral transmission of force, and how like a highly efficient level of force is transferred from one fiber to all the surrounding fibers, and you start to realize that, oh man, like when you lift, sure, we know that certain fibers are active and certain ones aren't, but there's a pretty effective force transmission. And then when we think about, okay, well, what is causing failure? It's when fibers can no longer produce force. So something else has to be coming in there to keep it going. It's maybe that it's not in a clear sequence like it would be with something heavy. So yeah, I would say that's pretty much, we just know that's probably the way a muscle works, and that if you are doing a high rep set to failure, that eventually you're recruiting everything. But then the question becomes, and I think you started to get to this, is recruitment and failure aren't necessarily the same thing as recruitment and getting a training effect for everything at a fiber level, right? All we know is that the final output of can I do another rep is no, but we don't know how much could get, like maybe you cycled in some high threshold motor units at the end, and this is their first time coming up, but everything else is so fatigued that they weren't enough to actually get another rep.
Right.
So does that high threshold motor unit and its associated fast twitch fibers, did they get trained from that high rep set?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we don't know yet. So then let me ask you that question. Where are you at right now with your theoretical, hypothetical thoughts on, is there a difference in fiber type growth from doing high rep sets to failure versus an equivalent total like impulse? We will say that, which I'm saying volume, but being more specific than say a low rep, high load set.
I don't know. I'm not convinced either way. I like to think I do. The first time I had heard of impulse, you had actually talked about a study that looked at impulse based off of rest intervals, or I think it was maybe tempo. And that was like an interesting concept for me, because I think if there was one sort of corollary factor to hypertrophy more than anything, maybe it is impulse, because it's accounting for the magnitude and the time that you're exposed to that. So I sort of think of impulse as on the per fiber level, rather than the set as a whole.
Which is by the way, I think that's a really cool take on it, because it helps to really kind of embed that concept in what we think probably causes hypertrophy. And just for anyone listening who's going like, what the fuck is impulse? Like, I watched Star Trek, but it's been a while. So impulse is simply a physics calculation of force times time. And you have probably actually thought about this more intuitively just from your bro exposure, like we've all had. Like people talk about time under tension, which is the total length of time you're contracting. And it's just also paying attention to the magnitude of that contraction. So, and you can also intuitively realize that matters, because we are always, like if we're moving, we're contracting. We know walking is a super high time, but very low contraction. That doesn't result in growth after you're, not sedentary. So anyway, it's kind of the combined factors of the total magnitude of tension, if we're talking about on the per fiber level, and also the time spent doing that contraction. So carry on.
Yeah. So I think when you look at, like Schoenfeld's had two papers that have sort of teased out the idea that it's not just about recruitment. Like we know, I think they compared the first paper that I'm thinking of, compared, I think 2 to 4 RM versus 8 to 12. Equated for the number.
Both.
Yeah. So the volume was certainly greater in the 3 sets of 8 to 12. if you're going by tonnage. But if you're going by number of sets, then like your total volume, I guess, is sort of equated. It just depends on how you're defining volume. But the 8 to 12 showed greater increase in hypertrophy. And we know that, training to failure, and even that the absolute loads that 2 to 4 rep max would require, we're probably getting full fiber recruitment with every rep in those sets as well. So I think it's not like, even though we're still recruiting the full spectrum in both of those scenarios, I think one thing that I would hypothesize or be curious to find out is that 8 to 12 resulting in just a greater degree of type 1 or like low threshold hypertrophy. Because you're affording that, as the set goes on, you're getting a training effect that's per fiber on those slow twitch before where you're forced to recruit those higher threshold motor units. And I think that's plausible. But then I think he has another study, 8 to 12 versus the 25 to 35. And those were equivalent as well. So there's probably like that sweet spot, which non-coincidentally, I mean, I think just through anecdote, people kind of have gravitated towards that moderate rep range. And I don't think that's by coincidence.
So that's interesting, because that results in different ways of potentially tracking volume depending on the repetition zone you're training in, right? Yeah. So that would mean that, hey, once you're doing, let's say, the 6 to 8 rep range or higher, so 6+, you might be able to just count sets. Like it is that, because at the 6 rep mark, you're recruiting everything, but you're doing as many possible reps you can while recruiting everything. But you're right at that threshold of where maybe if you're going a little lighter, you'd have to get a few more reps in.
Yeah.
And it's almost this kind of long elongated bell curve where a set of 20 or a set of 6 would actually in the end result in that same net impulse or close enough if you take both sets to failure.
Yeah.
Which is a super interesting concept, and I think it makes sense, and it's certainly, like, I don't know that that's true, but it certainly seems like when you look at all the studies out there where you match sets, that's what happens in terms of aggregate hypertrophy.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of how, when I program, like, conveniently it just kind of works out. I used to use tonnage as more of a metric to, I used to put more stock in it than I do now. Like I put very minimal stock in it now.
Yeah.
Just because it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of that volume. By quality, I just simply mean the recruitment aspect.
It's also got problems if you're working across people.
Exactly.
Because you take a 48 kilo female or you take a 120 kilo male, and they could be doing the exact same number of reps at the exact same percentage of 1RM, but the tonnage may be 3 times in the 120 just because he's stronger, if it's sets rep times load.
Yeah.
Then I think we've then progressed to maybe we should look at relative volume, where that absolute load is instead of a percentage 1RM, which I think is okay. But even then, like you said, it lumps it all together and you lose some of that understanding of that quality of volume and magnitude.
And I guess one thing I wanted to mention and kind of give credit where it's due, the first time I had really been exposed to that idea, like matching hard sets, was an article on Greg's website, Greg Knuckles' website. And I want to say his name's Nathan Jones. I could be wrong there, but it was a guest article written for Greg. And I remember at the time, it almost kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. I'm like, no, like tonnage matters. But like the more I started dissecting it, I'm like, wait, like, fuck, maybe it doesn't matter that much. I mean, it's not telling us what we actually want it to be telling us, we want to believe it's telling us. But I know, and I haven't read that article in a while, but I know at the end, I think Greg or Nate gave some recommendations on, number of sets within different rep ranges, which I think is the correct way to think of it. I don't think every rep range is created equal when you match number of sets, and that's been shown in that study with Schoenfeld with the 2 to 4 versus 8 to 12. So yeah, I think anything over like that 8-ish rep range, like as long as, and that's also assuming you're pushing them both to the same high
RPE.
relative intensity,
Yeah.
I think you're probably getting very similar outcomes in terms of overall hypertrophy.
Aggregate, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. Yeah, aggregate. I'm not sure if there's differences between type 1 and type 2 on that. And I think there's mixed research on that to the point where it's just inconclusive at this stage.
I would agree with that. Today, Greg's article, the Stronger by Science article, rubbed me the wrong way too, because I had come from the muscle and strength pyramids perspective, where I had the number of reps that I was using, which is just based off of the fact that we didn't yet have a meta-analysis on sets per week. We had Krieger's sets per session one, and then we had the Wernbaum systematic review that looked at just that kind of raw percentage gain bell curve. It was basically like an unfiltered meta-analysis, if you will, if anyone wants to get geeky with the stats. They just purely looked at how many reps they do, and then where was the most percentage gains in muscle mass, which is, it's not that bad actually.
No.
But it doesn't account for things like heterogeneity of the data, or one study being like weighting things too much, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, so I think I had that same initial reaction, and then I thought about it, and I was like, well, reps per set probably would matter if we're talking about heavy ass loads, because like you said, if that 3x3 doesn't compare to that 3x10, why? And okay, that's because each one of those reps in the 3x3 is maybe close to like maximal hypertrophy stimulus, or at least higher, but it's just not enough. So it might make sense to count each unit of repetitions when you're talking about like 6RM loads and heavier, which muddies the water further, for sure. But interestingly enough, we've got that that other recent meta-analysis looking at number of sets per week for strength, and it kind of with a similar dose response curve to the the 1 to 5, 5 to 9, 10 plus that we saw in Schoenfeld's. So it's almost like when you're not looking at hypertrophy and you're looking at skill development, it tends to wash out again with the number of sets, because I would say a heavy triple, each one of those is almost specific enough to a max single that you're going to test. But the closer you get to a single, the more it counts. So it's like almost like you can compare a heavy triple to a heavy 4, and they'd be more or less the same thing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. I think those higher rep sets, if anything, it's like, I think maybe you're getting similar type 1 or type 2 hypertrophy between the low and the high, because say everything above a 7 RPE, just for simplicity, is like full spectrum recruitment. I mean, we're basically going to be there for every rep in that low rep set, and then we're going to be there for 2/3 of the way through the set on that higher rep set. But what about all of, like, I guess one beef I kind of have with the term effective reps is I think everything below that is still contributing or potentially contributing to like slow twitch development.
It's a heuristic. It's not actually true. And I think that's a good thing to point out. It's a continuum, basically. You would think that the effectiveness of a 20 rep set is not like nothing until you've done 12, and then all of a sudden the last 8 reps do something. It's not that. It's basically this probably relatively even slope of effectiveness as you get closer to the 20th rep. And I would say it even extends all the way to 20, even though we're talking about an RPE 7. It's just that doing those last 3 reps might cause other problems in the rest of the workout or the week. So would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because I don't know. I think there might be something I'm not convinced on here. So would you say you're doing a set of 10 up to a 10 RPE, and you were looking on like the hypertrophic stimulus on a rep by rep basis. Are you saying you think maybe like rep 10 has a higher stimulus than rep 8? Or do you think it's just 2 more reps of that same stimulus?
That's a good question. Does it plateau and stay high? So you're just getting more max volume, or is it actually higher?
I think it plateaus. Well, my thought is it probably plateaus, and it's just you're getting more volume under that fully recruited state.
I would say yes, if somehow in a magical world the velocity of the rep 8 and rep 10 were the same, but they're not.
Yeah,
that's
true.
the thing. It's going to take you, that 10th rep is going to, like, our body doesn't actually count reps. Our body counts the magnitude of tension. And if that 10th rep is a 4-second rep, but your 8th one is a 3-second rep, then theoretically, if you're looking at just the rep, it's a little more time exposed to that level of tension.
Yeah, I'm glad we did this because I hadn't thought of that yet, and that's something kind of obvious that I hadn't even thought of. So, I think that's a good point. I think that's a really good point.
It's hard for that to be obvious because you have to think about this stuff. You have to dictate some organizing principles the way your brain works. So we think about reps, we think about sets, we think about tonnage, and then we forget that reps are actually just some arbitrary counting system. So yeah. And it's tough. Yeah. So I do technically think if we're going to categorize it by reps, that you would see this increasing stimulus level the further you go, because the hardest rep to complete is also the rep that takes the longest to complete, and it should be still at that same, like I would say recruitment plateaus, but stimulus doesn't, if that makes sense.
No, yes, that makes sense. I agree with you.
Cool.
I hadn't even thought of the velocity aspect, but it's, I'm sure it's somewhat minute. They're all going to be pretty slow, but I think like if you were to be as precise as possible, I could definitely see that. That makes sense.
Yeah, man.
That was good.
So you mentioned something that I don't know if I agree with, that perhaps for the slow twitch fibers, it's the same, and maybe I'm misrepresenting what you said, whether you're doing like a moderate or a high rep set in terms of their stimulus, because I don't know. Well, go ahead. Talk about that.
I was just going to say, I think that's probably where the disparity between like the 8 to 12 and the 2 to 4 come into play, because you're still getting the same amount of reps at full recruitment in both scenarios. It's like you're still getting, say, 3 reps at 100% recruitment in both scenarios, which is, it's impossible to know for sure because we don't know, like, the magnitude of tension per slow twitch fiber is going to be greater in the 2 to 4 as well. So that aspect, I guess that's my hypothesis, and I'm not sure it's been teased out yet.
Yeah, so my thoughts there are that, okay, if these slow twitch fibers are, even when they're producing max force, they are slower to fatigue, I would think they're also then slower to get a training effect. So it may be that in a 3RM, immediately every slow twitch fiber is recruited and it is exerting force, but by the time that set concludes, they haven't received a training effect, while those high threshold fast twitch fibers have. Maybe that is why you would, which I think is very plausible.
Hey there, dear listeners. The 3DMJ coaches have just booked our flights and scheduled our next filming session of Lifting Library Editions, and we cannot wait to share them with you. The Lifting Library is our all-in-one video course solution to perfecting the essential movements and exercises that every bodybuilder needs to know and execute well. Once you buy this thing, you have lifetime access to the course, which will increase in size, quality, and price year after year as it grows. We have invested a lot of time in this because we see it as something that is a very, very long-term and ever-evolving resource. So as of now, there are 12 chapters in this course. It's only $49, and that is the lowest price it'll ever be. These are extremely high-quality video tutorials, key performance strategies for executing the lifts correctly, and most importantly, detailed programming considerations that will tell you exactly how and why you should include or not include certain movements into your training program. So go to liftinglibrary.com, sign yourself up now for lifetime access, and every few months you'll be notified of when you have new content in your course so you can log back in and build upon your training education for many years to come. Again, that's liftinglibrary.com. Go there and sign yourself up for the free trial today.
But then the problem is that there's not great data looking at combined rep range training, showing that it's superior to one type of training with matched volume, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's two issues there. One, it could just be that maybe it doesn't matter, or two, it could just be like the 3 or 4 studies we have is just not enough to tease that out. I don't know. So where's your hunch lie? Do you think someone could just train 8 to 12 all the time and it wouldn't make a difference?
No, I don't think that. I don't think that, but I'm not sure why. That's kind of
right. The data wouldn't lead you to that conclusion.
Well, I mean, based on like just outcomes, like what we're achieving under, regardless of the rep range. I think there would almost need to be differences in specific fiber type hypertrophy across the rep ranges for that to really drive it home, that variation is required.
So that's a really cool way of logicking it. So you're saying that because we have similar growth between high rep and low rep training, therefore there has to be a different effect based on the way muscle works on different fibers for that to occur in aggregate. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, no, I think like for the case to be made convincingly for me that variation in rep range is optimal, I feel like there would have to be differences in physiology between the two rep.
Yeah, or at least outcome, Yeah. So there's actually another wrinkle in this one. This is what I was thinking about. Like, a group-based study is not very useful for this either, because there's a pretty big variation between individuals in whether one is slow twitch or fast twitch dominant. I almost feel like you would need to do, that study on rugby players where they looked at their testosterone and cortisol response to 2 different types of training, and then they put them on the one that should suck for them and the one that should be better. And then they saw that the testosterone cortisol response predicted which program they'd get stronger on. I feel like if we did biopsies of people and we went and we broke them into, like, let's say quartiles, and we put the people who had the highest percentage of fast twitch and slow twitch on different programs that were aimed to maximize that, that maybe that would be a better way to look at this. Because if we've got people who are, let's say, 70-30 or 30-70, and they all do a mixed group training thing, maybe you would see like basically the same net response, but through different pathways of which fibers are growing on a mixed program.
Yeah.
And then they would all get this. So you'd get like poor response in these guys, like high response in these guys for a net average. And then if they went on just to be like the moderate rep range training, they get the same thing. Everyone would just kind of not grow as much,
Right.
So,
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's one thing. We have to have a model where we were able to tease that out a little bit on an individual level.
Yeah, and one thing I want to clear up, when I guess I said I'm not convinced, or like one reason why I know it probably does matter, is I think just from an adherence standpoint, and just like less on a physiological level and more like on a behavioral level, and just joint integrity level. But I'm strictly speaking from like the baseline, like what's actually occurring, like that
in a muscle.
Yeah, the mechanical signal, is it really different? So I do think, like, I posted that question on Instagram, asking if there was any value to, I think, rep ranges under 6 reps in a bodybuilder's program. And the biggest response I got to that was like, yes, because it'll allow you to train heavier, like in those higher rep ranges. Now, like, I agree with that, but you also have to think like the principles of specificity still apply here. Like, well,
not only that, but they would need to go back and read your first blog post again. Because that's what Eric Helms would have said in 2012. But now I'm realizing that I don't know that just because you're stronger and you can do 20 reps with 225 versus 20 reps with 185, that actually, if the RPE and the number of reps is the same, would be a greater growth stimulus. All that's proven is that you've gotten stronger, not that you can actually expose your tissue to more stress now that you've generated progressive overload. You know?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But yeah, that was the most common rebuttal. I mean, I do think you're right. I think, it would make you stronger in those higher volume rep ranges, like conducive to accruing volume, but training in those higher rep ranges, I think you'd get more bang for your buck in that regard, because you're training that specific rep range to begin with.
And I've had this argument with people, which is funny because I've been like one of the champions of you got to get stronger as a bodybuilder thing. And I would say I still am, but just for different reasons. So the pushback I would get when I tell someone, no, you being stronger is just a result of it. It's, a 10 reps at an 8 is going to be a 10 reps at an 8, no matter how strong you are in terms of the stimulus. And they go, but on an absolute level, that's not true. Like those fibers still have to lift a heavier load.
Yeah, you're getting a larger like magnitude aspect of that impulse.
But then I tell them, but then I go, well, I don't actually think that makes sense as far as growth, because if that was true, you would get this runaway hypertrophy response as you got stronger. Like if like, let's say in your first year of training, you could do 10 reps with 225 on back squats. And then in your 10th year of training, you could do 10 reps with 405 on back squats. You should be like, oh my God, I'm getting so huge all the time. Like I just did twice or close to twice the stimulus now later. But I think what you're forgetting is that the amount of force produced and therefore the amount of tension received by a muscle fiber is less as it's hypertrophied, because it's increasing, right? Yeah. So the same amount of relative tension will produce more force. So I think that you basically your strength is a byproduct, of your growth in some ways. So yeah, I actually don't think that's true. That as you get stronger with heavier loads, it allows your light load training to be more effective. I think that might be true for like 3 months to 6 months of your first training, where like you're a novice and you're so weak, but this is more neuromuscular, that you can't actually expose your muscles to an effective training stimulus. Like you can't really get hurt unless you do something ridiculous early on. This is proven by all of the old people in the gym you see, like putting themselves into crazy positions on a lat pull down and not and they're like they're 85 and you're like, oh my God, if I did that, my shoulder popped through my clavicle, So
yeah, for sure.
So I guess for me, the arguments for using more than one repetition range in your training are, like you said, enjoyment and adherence, and then also maybe managing monotony and strain. So basically that there is actually some inherent value in varying your training stress.
Right.
And it's almost like different stresses, because like a 20 rep set kind of sucks on certain movements.
Right.
But it's certainly not going to leave your joints feeling beat up like a heavy 5 rep set on those same movements.
Exactly.
Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think just the variation in terms of your ability, like if you stuck to the same rep range, I think you would eventually have like residual repercussions that would, you would almost need to go lighter to a higher rep range in order to, maintain a stimulus while giving your joints just a break. So yeah, I think that goes, like the longevity and behavioral side of it, I think is the biggest reasons for me. One thing that's interesting to me is just and I think Mike Israetel could be somebody who'd be good to talk to about this. And I'm not sure where his stance on this is, but the aspect of variation is preventing like
anabolic resistance.
Anabolic resistance, yeah, that's the term I'm looking for. But mechanistically, like I'm not like I want to like take that apart and understand why that is.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like you, I agree with that in principle, that you need some level of change in a stimulus to keep it going. And
but is the change enough? Like, is increasing the load or doing another rep? Is that enough change? Like, is there
absolutely,
like what about what's occurring to prevent you from continuing to progress within a rep range?
Right.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I always kind of go back to, like, hypertrophy itself isn't the only pathway to strength, and it's not even really a direct adaptation to your training. So it makes me wonder, like, do you get anabolic resistance in that way to the type of training bodybuilders do that already has some inherent variation? I maybe if you did, I'm only going to do 10s, period. And I'm only going to do these 6 exercises, period. Or the single exercise we want to talk about, like from a study design perspective, then maybe he is right. Of course, I believe that anabolic resistance or any kind of stimulus stagnation occurs, is probably how I would put it. That sounds neat. Make a book. Stimulus stagnation.
Stimulus stagnation.
I think that happens. SS7, yes. Wow, I could make all the money. So I think that happens, and you're right that would be a theoretical rationale to change things up to some degree. But like you, I don't know that happens, or why it does. One way that you, speaking of doing, like, high rep sets only or low rep sets only, you blew my mind with one of your I think your second blog post, where you basically, and this is one of those things, like you're like, I don't know why I didn't think of that. It's easier to add a rep to a high rep set than it is a low load set, because just mathematically, like, if I want to go from 4 reps to 5 reps, I have to be like basically 20% stronger.
Yeah.
But if I want to go from, like 20 reps to 21 reps, I only have to be like 5% stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is way different.
And it can make the difference between, like, achieving an overload or just staying the same.
Or even just seeing that there is an overload still occurring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like the fractional plates of reps. It's like
exactly.
It's like I've had, it's like a female athlete that's sort of stuck in that mid 100s range on their bench. Like, oftentimes it just takes increasing their rep ranges or using fractional plates to get through it. Otherwise, you can just kind of spin your wheels. It's like you might move that last rep a bit faster. But if anything, kind of to your point, which is interesting, it's like if you're doing them at a faster velocity, like, it shows you're, like, getting a little bit stronger. But then the total tension would be less.
Yeah.
So it's like it's an interesting thing to think about. It's like, okay, well, I could be progressing but getting less of a continued stimulus.
Progression is the reason why progression stops, which I think is really interesting to think of. It's a different way of looking at it.
I think I agree with that. So I think we're both on the same page from a adherence standpoint and a practicality standpoint. It's, variation makes a lot of sense. But, like, I guess that's, like, if you look at, like, a DUP model across the week with a hypertrophy, like a 12-10-8 undulation pattern, it's like, are you really getting anything different across those days? And, like, I'm not sure you are. I think you're getting stronger. Like, I think if you were to test your 8 rep max at the end of it, it would be better if you did a 12-10-8 versus a 12-12-12. But yeah, I don't know. I think one area where I'm really interested is with that I want to do more reading on is, like, how much intensity work is really required to maximally express strength. Because, like, if you can train,
could a single to a 7 be enough?
Yeah, and I think that's something, like, with a whole, like, looking at an entire training cycle, like, across an entire year. It's like, could you spend all, like, say you only did nationals to nationals each year, like, could you spend all but 7 weeks of that process, below 70% on average, And I
Mhm.
mean, and that kind of goes back, like one of the questions I asked last week on my Instagram was like, okay, what bottlenecks in a practical sense, like what bottlenecks progress the most? Is it joint integrity and injury, or is it like, fuck, I can't get enough tonnage? It's like that's
Yeah.
never really the case.
Yeah.
So it's usually people just get banged up. So I think
Mhm.
it's important. I think for me, I'm trying, because I don't plan on competing until nationals if I compete at all, in a meet, and I'm really sort of seeing what I can get away with in terms of minimizing the amount of heavy exposure, or like at these developmental stages of a meet prep, like outside of just reminding yourself that you're strong occasionally, like do you really need to have like a heavy day at all?
Yeah.
Like you could maintain proficiency, but for a lot of athletes that I program for, I think it's important to really buy into the process, because in a developmental stage of prep where the focus is on hypertrophy, like you might see your 1RM, like your estimated 1RM go down. And I think a lot of people really panic when that happens, which is why I think it's so important to understand like baseline, like mechanistically what the objective is of each stage. And I think and how each of those phases has like a residual impact on the next. So one thing I'm trying with my own training is just seeing like how little I can get away with heavy work for these hypertrophy emphasized stages. And it is hard. I think psychologically it's hard, because I still include them when I program for people. Like a volume block would still probably include like if I did like a DUP model, would include like a 4-rep day or something like that, or a top set followed by some volume. But I'm not even sure that's necessary. Like I think the more advanced, if I had to guess, the more advanced an athlete becomes, like I could take probably a year off from squatting, and then within 3 weeks, be fine. Like in terms of just the actual feeling, like I wouldn't feel lost in the movement. It's sort of like riding a bike in a sense. No, I think neurologically there is a training effect that occurs there in terms of, the ability to recruit and like the firing rates of those motor neurons. But I guess, yeah, long-winded. I'm just trying to see like what is the minimal amount you really even need to optimize that outcome.
So I have like 3 or 4 thoughts on that, or about that you stimulated. So the first one is that while we kind of summarized with, hey, whether or not we get preferential fiber growth from different rep ranges or not, it probably makes sense to vary things. How you vary things might be different depending on which that is, whether we do get preferential fiber growth or whether we just need variation. Because you could do exactly what you said. You could have a 15, 12, 10 for always, and that would be enough to get the variation. And if it didn't matter as from a fiber type perspective, then you wouldn't be losing out. But if indeed you do need, heavy loads and light loads to get the full spectrum of, fiber growth, then you kind of need to always have some heavy lifting in there, and you probably should always have some pretty light load lifting in there. Like we've been talking about how, like you often talk about how fast twitch does a fiber get, like, those type 2X, what's the hardest shit to actually recruit. But what's the most fatigue resistant slow twitch muscles to recruit too? How high rep do we need to go? But so yeah, I mean, we don't know if we need to break it down into like what time course it matters either. And there's a number of ways to try to solve this. Like you said, you can approach it with a mesocycle based or microcycle based, like or undulation pattern that even in a developmental block includes some work in like the 4 to 6 rep range. That can be your heavy-ish equivalent in a high volume block. That might become, the 1 to 3 rep range in a peaking block, for example. Another way to do it, which I've been playing a lot with, and this is definitely inspired by Mike T, would be, a single at a 7 to 8 RPE, which is, 90 to 92% of 1RM. And then shouldn't be generating too much stress, gives you an idea of where your strength is at, keeps that kind of, 5th gear, and then you do your volume work. And unless you get a issue, like unless you have joint issue, even like regardless of the volume of the heavy work, just a single, I think that's a viable strategy.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a number of ways to try to get around that. But it's a question of really, we don't quite yet know what type of variation we need and for what reason yet,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is kind of cool.
No, I think it's awesome. I think that idea of doing a single or a top set of somewhere over like 85% can be very valuable. And one thing theoretical is, like, I think it could maybe sort of think of the relationship between fitness and fatigue. If you do like a single and an 8, and then you do sets of 10 after, let's say you do that, like you probably are going to be getting higher levels of recruitment out of the gate on those sets of 10 because it's sort of somewhat been potentiated by that single at 8. So you could be getting like you could be achieving that high threshold stimulus a bit sooner, just by doing that one single. And I don't know if that's, been shown, but it makes, I mean, anytime you, like, if you do a submaximal single and then you go and you drop the weight and do sets of 10, like, it feels a lot lighter. Like your bar speed is much faster. In most cases, I think it just depends on how heavy that first single is. But could you be getting a higher level of like stimulus or fitness with a lower level of fatigue, like, to actually get there? So like that could be the best of both worlds,
Yeah, that would be easy to test in a lab too. You would just have 2 volume matched warm-ups, one that ends with like a couple reps at 60%, and the other one that ends and then you just go up slightly and load, and then do as many reps as possible at 70%.
Right.
And then the other one ends at a single at 85%, and maybe there's just bigger jumps and less total sets to equate the volume of the warm-up. And then you go down in weight 70% and do as many reps as possible. And I think, on paper, like the warm-ups, it's equated volume, and there's such a low number of reps on each one, it shouldn't make a difference. And then it should be the same result. But if you are getting that potentiation effect, you would think you'd see something better out of the group. And I think you need to look at hypertrophy, not strength, because if you look at strength, that single at 85% in and of itself could be enough to make that group stronger.
Absolutely. So, it'd be interesting for sure. I will say, like, I prepped for an Arnold meet. It's funny, I've done that meet 3 times, and each time I've done it, I've had to work around some injury and get creative in order to even get there. But I think the one 2 years ago, I would do a single at an 8 and then follow it up with like goblet squat BFR. And it actually, like, it was probably one of the best peaks I've ever had. And it almost like pissed me off how well it went. It's like, I need to know why this happened. But I got some gears turning. And much of that is just theoretical at this point. But I think, it's possible I was getting enough training effect from like the one single, and then I was getting like the volume from BFR with a low degree of like muscle damage and fatigue associated with it. So that was super interesting trying that.
Yeah, and I'm very interested to see where, as we have a better understanding of this, how much does some of the ways we program change? Like maybe a dual sport athlete 10 years from now, when we really kind of have a feel on this, is going to have one day where they do freaking like circuit on machines only, and then another day where they just work up to a single at a 7 RPE on the big 3, and then as they get closer to comp, that becomes a single at 8, and the circuits, they drop a set off, they really become delineated.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. That'll be super interesting to see. I think the disparity between the two, like, a lot of people, really harp on the specificity side of things. Like, well, you're like, I don't really think hypertrophy is a specific goal,
Nope.
So I think the dual athlete can exist pretty easily. Like if you add in biceps and medial delts, it's like what about a normal powerlifting, quote unquote powerlifting program? Like what isn't it hitting outside of those two muscle groups?
Do a lat pull down, do a row, maybe do a hamstring curl, calf raise, and you're solid.
Yeah. And I think you also see just in practice, you see people in the gym, and like I know like a lot of the high level powerlifters, like 93 kilo class, it's not like they're hurting for size. It's like I'm not like they're all big guys, like they're just not as lean, and so it makes me think like that provides support to the fact that like, okay, like how much more effective is this like bodybuilding focused program? Like it might not be anything,
no one walks up to Ellis McLean and goes,
try doing a set yeah. I can tell you only stick to reps under 6 for your bench press.
Now excuse me as I take 3 minutes to walk around you because you're
so so I think just like the actual evidence staring us in the face can't be ignored either. Just the it's funny because this idea and this conversation has a lot of complex layers, but it also simplifies or can simplify a lot and make things just a lot more straightforward for some people. And I think that's ultimately what I'm hoping for with some of these, like some of the posts that I'm making is just to get people thinking and like put that analytical mind to work for good reasons rather than like obsessive reasons,
Yeah, I like that. So speaking of that, let's actually give some of the people who managed to stay with us, although I'll probably break this up into parts, some practical advice. I think for me, the big take homes from your stuff was, hey, what we've known for a little while now is you have options for hypertrophy. You can train in various rep ranges with various movements, and so long as you're putting tension on everything, you'll grow. The second one was, hey, if you are plateaued, maybe some high rep work can enable you to see if you're actually doing enough. If you can, maybe you can't add in any kind of reasonable time frame a rep to the 8 to 12 rep range, but you might be able to the 15 to 20 if you're willing to put that in for a bit. Which I thought was a very cool perspective. And then I guess the final take home from what we discussed is it probably makes sense to train with heavy, moderate, and light loads, but there's a lot of ways to distribute it right now because we don't know enough. That could be mesocycles, that could be microcycles, or that could literally be within the same training session. And I don't think any of those are the wrong answer.
I agree, 100%.
Cool. Well, dude, this has been stimulating. I know it's, I feel very stimulated. I know it's been, I know it's been, I always enjoy talking to you because you think differently than most, which is a useful way to ping ideas off one another. So I just wanted to say thank you, Brian. And
thank you, Helms.
You got it, man.
Yeah,
and,
this was a blast. This was fun. And I got something out of this for sure in terms of, you answered like the velocity aspect of the reps. I'm glad I asked that because it would have taken me a while, I think, to figure that one out. But it's it's a good point.
Yeah, man, it's a two-way street, and hopefully everyone listening got a thing or two out of this as well.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. 3DMJ prides itself on keeping this show, our blog, and our YouTube channel as free and relevant sources of information for our community week after week. We also release additional free video courses as often as possible at 3dmjvault.com. If you'd like to help support our mission and our work, please consider becoming a monthly patron of our endeavors. Go to patreon.com/team3dmj and donate as little as $1 per month to our cause of helping educate and grow the drug-free bodybuilding and powerlifting communities worldwide. You can definitely choose to donate more, and if you do so, we'll send you discount codes for future use on any of our paid products. But any little bit helps, and we appreciate your monthly support in any amount that you see fit. So again, you can start assisting the team at patreon.com/team3dmj. That's patreon.com/team3dmj. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next show.